Hello and welcome to Geopolitics, the long game, power, money, and the world they don't want you to know. Season 1, Episode 2. In the last episode, we looked at a brief introduction into geopolitics, a sort of soft opening. Now we start to look at the details defining the drawn-up battle lines that all began with a map in 1904. Have a look at a map of Eurasia, not a political map with borders and flags, but a physical map with mountains, rivers, deserts, plains, coastlines, and ask yourself a single question. If you wanted to control this landmass, all of it, from Lisbon to Vladivostok, where would you start? A British geographer answered that question in 1904. His answer was so precise, so uncomfortable, that it became the hidden operating system of every major strategic decision of the 20th century. And of this one. His name was Halford Mackinder. He was also one of the co-founders of the London School of Economics. But the map he drew, the heartland, the rimland, the world island, is the same map that NATO planners, Chinese strategists, and Pentagon wargamers are still using right now. Today, we go deeper into that map, and by the end of this episode, you'll be able to read it yourself. In the last episode, we introduced Halford Mackinder and his central claim. Whoever controls the interior of Eurasia controls the world. Today, we unpick exactly what he meant and why it matters. Now, Mackinder divided the world into 3 zones. Think of them as concentric rings, each one wrapped around the next. The center, the heartland. This is the vast interior of the Eurasian continent, roughly Russia and Central Asia. It is landlocked. It cannot be reached by sea power. It is, in Mackinder's words, the pivot area, the zone that any would-be world power must control or neutralize. Whoever holds the heartland holds the key to the world. Surrounding the heartland, the inner or marginal crescent, what would later be called the rimland. This is the arc of coastal territories that fringes the heartland. It includes Western Europe, the Middle East, South Asia and East Asia. These are the zones where land power and sea power meet and contest. They are historically the most fought over territories on Earth. Look at the map. Every major war of the last 2 centuries has been fought in this arc. And surrounding everything, the outer crescent, the offshore islands and continents that sit beyond Eurasia altogether. Britain, Japan, the Americas, Australia. These are the sea powers, nations that project force from beyond the Eurasian landmass. Mackinder's formula, stated simply, is if any single power came to dominate the heartland, controlling its resources and able to project outward into the rimland, it would be unstoppable. It could threaten, encircle, and eventually overwhelm the outer sea powers. The formula he wrote in 1904 and refined in 1919 states, "Who rules East Europe commands the heartland. Who rules the heartland commands the world island. Who rules the world island commands the world." East Europe, meaning primarily what we now call Ukraine, Poland, and the Baltic states, is the gateway. Control it, and you control access to the heartland itself. Now, although it was written in 1904, that is still the geography of today's conflict. Now, Mackinder's theory was enormously influential, but it had a powerful critic, and understanding the disagreement between them explains almost everything about 20th century American strategy. Nicholas Spykman was a Dutch-born American geopolitical theorist, working at Yale in the 1940s. He read Mackinder carefully and said, "You got it backwards." Spykman's argument was that it isn't the heartland that matters most, it's the rimland, the coastal fringe, the arc that runs from Western Europe through the Middle East, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and up to East Asia. This is where the majority of the world's population lives, where its economic productivity is concentrated, and where its most critical sea lanes run. Spykman's counter-formula ran as, "Who controls the rimland rules Eurasia. Who rules Eurasia controls the destinies of the world." The practical implication is that the United States does not need to control the interior of Eurasia. What it must prevent at all costs is any single hostile power consolidating control of the rimland. If that happened, if one nation came to dominate Western Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia simultaneously, American power would be surrounded and eventually strangled. This is the operating logic of every major American military commitment since 1945. NATO exists to prevent hostile domination of the Western European rimland. The US Fifth Fleet sits in Bahrain to ensure that no hostile power controls the Middle Eastern rimland. American bases in Japan, South Korea, and now increasingly the Pacific Island chain are there to contest Chinese dominance of the East Asian rimland. Every one of those commitments flows directly from Spikeman's 1942 framework. So, we have two theories, both enormously consequential. Mackinder says control the heartland, Spikeman says control the rimland. The insight is that they are not contradictory. They describe the same contest from opposite sides. The heartland power, historically Russia, pushes outward towards the rimland coast. The offshore sea power, historically Britain, now America, pushes inward to contain it. This is the permanent structural contest of Eurasian geopolitics, and it has been running in one form or another for 2 centuries. Theory is one thing, but here is where it becomes visceral. In 1997, after the Soviet Union had collapsed, after the Cold War was supposedly over, after Francis Fukuyama had declared the end of history, Zbigniew Brzezinski published a book. It was called The Grand Chessboard, American Primacy and its Geostrategic Imperatives. Brzezinski had been Jimmy Carter's national security advisor. He was one of the most influential strategic thinkers in modern American history. And in this book, he wrote out American grand strategy with a candor that is almost shocking to read today. His central argument was that the United States had emerged from the Cold War as the world's sole superpower. To maintain that primacy, it had to prevent any rival from consolidating control of Eurasia. The key battleground was what he called the Eurasian chessboard. And on that board, the decisive chessman was Ukraine. He wrote that without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be a Eurasian empire. With Ukraine, Russia automatically becomes an empire. Ukraine was, in his analysis, the geopolitical pivot, the gateway to the heartland, the territory whose alignment would determine whether Russia could ever re-emerge as a continental power, capable of threatening American primacy. This was published in 1997, 17 years before the Maidan Color Revolution, 25 years before the full-scale invasion. John Mearsheimer has made the same argument, but from a different direction. In a now famous 2015 lecture, he said that the United States and its allies bear principal responsibility for the Ukraine crisis, not because Russia is innocent, but because expanding NATO and the EU into Ukraine constituted, from Moscow's perspective, an existential strategic threat. He said it would end up in tears, and he was right. Douglas MacGregor, a retired Army colonel, argued that American strategists know perfectly well what the Mackinder-Spikeman framework predicts, and that the policy decisions of the last 3 decades have been a deliberate attempt to prevent Russia from ever consolidating the heartland, regardless of the human cost. This is what geopolitical analysis looks like when it is applied honestly. It does not tell you who the good guys are. It tells you why each actor does what it does, and why certain conflicts were, in a meaningful sense, predictable long before the first shot was fired. Everything we've discussed so far has centered on the Russia-West axis of the heartland contest. But Mackinder's framework has a second application that is now arguably more urgent: China. China is a rimland power, a coastal nation with massive economic productivity and an increasingly powerful military. But its vision under Xi Jinping is explicitly heartland. The Belt and Road Initiative, the vast network of infrastructure investments stretching from East Asia through Central Asia, through the Middle East, into Africa and Europe, is a heartland strategy. It is an attempt to bind the interior of Eurasia to Chinese economic influence, to build the overland connectivity that would make Chinese power independent of the sea lanes that the American Navy currently dominates. If you draw a line connecting China's Belt and Road initiatives on a map, it traces the rimland almost precisely, and its ultimate logic, consolidating influence across the Eurasian landmass, is a thing Mackinder said a century ago that would make any power unstoppable. This is why the American strategic community is more exercised about China than about Russia. Russia is a heartland power, but it is demographically declining and economically constrained. China is a rimland power with the economic weight to potentially do what no power has ever done, dominate both the rimland and project deep into the heartland simultaneously. When you see news about Taiwan, the South China Sea, American bases in the Pacific, or Chinese investments in African ports, you are watching the Mackinder-Spikeman contest play out in real time. The map is the same map, only now the players have multiplied. We go back to Brzezinski's Grand Chessboard, but to a specific passage that most people have never read. In the book, Brzezinski identifies 5 key geopolitical pivots, states whose location makes them of outsized strategic importance, regardless of their own power. He names them Azerbaijan, South Korea, Turkey, Iran, and Ukraine. Of Ukraine, he writes that it is a new and important piece on the Eurasian chessboard, and that its independence is critical to limiting Russian power. He then goes further. He says that if Ukraine were to fall back under Moscow's domination, Russia's prospects for re-emerging as an imperial power would be dramatically enhanced. And this would have profound consequences for American primacy. The year, again, is 1997. The book is readily available online. Everything that followed was not a surprise to anyone who had read it. The move was recorded in plain sight, in a bestseller. That is what the notation of the long game looks like, when you finally know to read it. In the next episode, Empire, we move from the map to the machine, how empires are actually built, how they sustain themselves, and what happens when the cost of maintenance begins to outrun the benefits. Now, if you enjoyed this episode and it gave you a new way of reading the map, please share it, subscribe and/or comment. As the more people who understand this framework, the harder it becomes to sell them a war without explaining its actual geography. My name is Richard. This is Geopolitics, the long game. Next, we look at the machine that runs the game, the empire itself.